I knew something was wrong the moment my kitchen lights dimmed on that scorching July afternoon in Mesa, Arizona. One second I was reaching for a glass of water, the next my entire house felt like it was running on backup power. The refrigerator kicked off with an unsettling groan, the ceiling fan slowed to a lazy crawl, and my laptop battery icon started flashing yellow. I lived in Sagaro Vista Estates, a tidy suburban development where the HOA rules were thicker than a phone book and twice as boring. Most days I kept my head down, paid my dues on time, and avoided the neighborhood drama that seemed to multiply like rabbits every spring. But that afternoon, standing in my dimmed kitchen watching my ice maker struggle to function, I realized the drama had come looking for me. I walked outside into the 108-degree heat, squinting against the brutal sun that turned the asphalt into something resembling molten lava. That's when I saw it. 3 houses down, positioned directly on the corner lot where Patricia Morrison lived, was an absolutely massive white event tent. The kind you'd see at weddings or corporate functions, with clear plastic windows and enough square footage to host a small concert. Under normal circumstances, seeing a tent in the neighborhood wouldn't have triggered any alarm bells. People threw parties, I got that, but this wasn't just any tent. Running from Patricia's house to the tent was a thick orange extension cord, snaking across her perfectly manicured lawn like some kind of industrial serpent. And that extension cord, I noticed with growing irritation, wasn't plugged into her house at all. I followed the cord with my eyes, tracing its path from the tent back toward the property line between our lots. My stomach dropped when I realized where it led. The cord disappeared behind my fence into my backyard, where my outdoor electrical outlet sat innocently on the side of my house. She couldn't have. But the evidence was right there, bold as brass in the afternoon sun. I marched around to my backyard, threw open the gate, and confirmed my worst suspicion. Patricia Morrison, the 47-year-old HOA president with her signature blonde bob and perpetually pinched expression, had plugged her massive event tent directly into my external power outlet. Not only had she trespassed on my property, but she was actively stealing my electricity to power what looked like an entire circus operation. I could hear the hum of industrial fans and air conditioning units running full blast inside that tent, all of it drawing power from my meter, my bill, my dime. I stood there for a full minute, letting the audacity of it all sink in. Patricia Morrison wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA president, a position she'd held for 6 consecutive years through a combination of aggressive campaigning, and the fact that most people in the neighborhood would rather eat glass than attend monthly board meetings. She was famous for her violation notices, which she handed out like candy on Halloween. Too many weeds in your rock garden, violation. Christmas lights up past January 2nd, violation. Car parked on the street for more than 48 hours, violation and a threat of towing. She ran the neighborhood like her own personal fiefdom, and most people just accepted it as the cost of living in Sagaro Vista Estates. But this was theft, plain and simple, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I unplugged the extension cord from my outlet, heard the distant sound of equipment powering down in the tent, and waited. It took less than 2 minutes before Patricia came storming around the corner, her white linen pantsuit somehow still crisp despite the oppressive heat. "Excuse me." She called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What do you think you're doing?" I held up the plug, letting it dangle between us like evidence in a courtroom. "I'm pretty sure I should be asking you that question, Patricia. This was plugged into my house, my electricity." Without my permission. Her face flushed, but not with embarrassment, with indignation. I need power for the neighborhood appreciation event. It's tomorrow. I sent out an email 2 weeks ago explaining that we'd need to use some auxiliary power sources. Auxiliary power sources, I repeated slowly, tasting each word. You mean stealing electricity from my house? I'm not stealing anything, Stephen. She said my name like it was an accusation. The HOA is hosting a community event. Everyone benefits. I assumed you'd be willing to contribute, especially considering how much the HOA does for property values. Contributing would be if you asked me first, I said, keeping my voice level. Breaking into my backyard and plugging into my outlet without permission isn't contributing. It's theft. And trespassing. Patricia's expression hardened. She crossed her arms over her chest, a pose I recognized from countless HOA meetings where she'd shot down reasonable requests with bureaucratic efficiency. You're being dramatic. It's just a little electricity for one event. The Neighborhood Appreciation Day is important for community cohesion. Then use your own electricity, I suggested. Your house is right there. My breaker system can't handle the load. She waved dismissively toward the tent. We have industrial cooling units, a sound system, catering warmers and lighting. I calculated that we'd need approximately 15,000 watts for the full setup. My home electrical system maxes out at 12,000. I blinked at her. So you decided to overload mine instead. I assumed you'd be reasonable about this. Reasonable would have been asking. Like a normal person. Hey, Stephen, can I use your power for my event? And then I could have said no, and you could have rented a generator like everyone else who throws outdoor events. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. The HOA budget doesn't cover generator rentals, but it covers the electricity you plan to steal from me. I shook my head. How long were you planning to keep this plugged in? The event runs from noon to 6 tomorrow. Plus setup time today and takedown Sunday morning. She said it like she was doing me a favor by being transparent. Approximately 36 hours total. I did some quick math in my head. 15,000 watts running for 36 hours would be 540 kilowatt hours. At Mesa's summer electricity rates of about 15 cents per kilowatt hour, she was planning to stick me with an $80 bill. Maybe more if it pushed me into a higher usage tier. And that was assuming everything ran as efficiently as she claimed. Absolutely not, I said. Rent a generator. Use battery packs. I don't care. But you're not using my power. Patricia's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on an alarming crimson. You're being incredibly selfish right now. This event is for everyone in the neighborhood. We have activities planned for the children, a catered lunch, a raffle with prizes. All of that requires electricity. All of that required you to plan better, I countered. Your poor planning doesn't constitute an emergency on my part, or permission to commit theft. I could write you up for non-cooperation with HOA activities, she threatened, pulling out her phone like she was about to document a violation right there. Write me up for refusing to let you steal from me. Please do. I'd love to see how that holds up in court. We stared at each other across my desert-landscaped backyard, the tension thick enough to choke on. Finally, Patricia made a disgusted sound in the back of her throat and turned on her heel. You're going to regret this attitude, Stephen. The HOA has rules for a reason, and people who don't contribute to community welfare tend to find themselves under extra scrutiny. She marched back toward her property, leaving the unplugged extension cord lying in my yard like a dead snake. I coiled it up, carried it around to her front lawn, and dropped it on her doorstep. If she wanted her cord back, she could retrieve it herself. I wasn't about to be her personal storage unit on top of everything else. Back inside my house, the power had stabilized. The refrigerator hummed contentedly, the ceiling fan spun at full speed, and my laptop had returned to charging normally. But I couldn't shake the anger simmering in my gut. It wasn't just the attempted theft, though that was bad enough. It was the entitlement, the assumption that her position as HOA president gave her carte blanche to do whatever she wanted. Consequences be damned. How many other times had she pulled something like this? How many other neighbors had she steamrolled because they didn't want to make waves? I spent the rest of the afternoon stewing about it while researching Arizona laws on electricity theft and HOA overreach. What I found was enlightening. According to Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 13-1802, theft of utility services was a Class 1 misdemeanor, punishable by up to 6 months in jail and $2,500 in fines. Even attempted theft could be prosecuted if there was clear intent and action taken. Patricia plugging into my outlet definitely qualified as action, but I also knew that going straight to the police would make me look petty. In neighborhoods like Saguaro Vista Estates, you didn't call the cops on the HOA president over what she'd probably characterize as a misunderstanding. The social fallout would be worse than the crime itself. No, I needed to be smarter about this. I needed to hit Patricia where it would actually hurt, where her authority couldn't shield her from consequences. That's when I remembered something my buddy Marcus had told me last year when he dealt with an electricity billing dispute at his house in Chandler. The utility company had audited his meter after he'd noticed suspicious usage patterns, and they'd found that his neighbor's pool pump was wired incorrectly, drawing power from Marcus's line instead of the neighbor's. The utility company had taken it very seriously, conducting a full investigation and eventually forcing the neighbor to pay restitution plus penalties. If Patricia was brazen enough to try stealing power from me, what were the odds she'd pulled similar stunts before? Better yet, what were the odds her own electrical usage was entirely above board? People who felt entitled to other people's resources rarely limited themselves to a single transgression. The next morning, I called Salt River Project, the utility company that serviced our area. I got transferred twice before landing with someone in their fraud investigation department, a patient-sounding woman named Carol who listened to my story without interrupting. So she actually plugged her equipment into your outdoor outlet? Carol asked, and I could hear the click of a keyboard in the background. Yes, a heavy-duty extension cord running from the event tent on her property to my house. I have photos if you need them. I'd taken several pictures the previous afternoon, documenting the cord's path and the connection point. Please email those to the address I'm going to give you, Carol said. This constitutes theft of utility services, which we take very seriously. But I'm also interested in what you mentioned about her own electrical capacity. Did she explicitly state that her home system couldn't handle the load she was trying to draw? She said her breaker maxes out at 12,000 watts, and she needed 15,000 for her event. I pulled up the voice memo I'd recorded during our confrontation. Arizona was a one-party consent state for recordings, which meant I didn't need Patricia's permission to document our conversation. I have audio of her admitting it. There was a long pause. Mr. Carter, I'm going to be frank with you. What you're describing suggests that Miss Morrison may have made unauthorized modifications to her electrical system, or she may be drawing power from an alternative source. A standard residential property in your neighborhood should have at least a 200 amp service, which translates to about 24,000 watts of capacity. The fact that she's claiming a 12,000 watt maximum is concerning. My interest sharpened. Concerning how? Either her electrical panel is severely outdated and potentially dangerous, or she's not being truthful about her capacity. Given that she was willing to commit theft of services from your property, I think it warrants a full meter audit on her address. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement? Absolutely, I said without hesitation. Carol walked me through the process. I'd need to email the photos and audio recording, fill out a formal complaint form, and be available for a possible follow-up interview. In exchange, SRP would conduct a comprehensive audit of Patricia's property, examining her meter for evidence of tampering, unusual usage patterns, or illegal bypasses. If they found anything suspicious, they'd investigate further and potentially involve law enforcement. I submitted everything that morning, feeling a grim satisfaction as I attached the photos of Patricia's extension cord snaking across our properties. Whatever she'd been planning for her neighborhood appreciation event, she'd have to figure it out without my electricity. The event itself went ahead as scheduled that Saturday. I watched from my living room window as neighbors trickled into Patricia's yard throughout the afternoon, lured by the promise of free food and entertainment. She'd apparently found some alternative power solution, probably borrowed generators from someone else who was more susceptible to her pressure tactics. The tent glowed white in the sun, and I could hear music drifting across the desert afternoon, some kind of instrumental jazz that probably tested well with the homeowner demographic. I didn't attend, partly out of principle, partly because I knew Patricia would make a scene if I showed my face. Instead, I spent the afternoon organizing my garage and pointedly ignoring the festivities 3 doors down. A few neighbors stopped by to ask why I wasn't at the event. I kept my answers vague, saying I had other commitments. No need to poison the well before SRP completed their investigation. Sunday morning, I was pulling weeds from my rock garden when I noticed the SRP truck parked in front of Patricia's house. 2 technicians in high-visibility vests were examining her electrical meter, one of them taking photos while the other made notes on a tablet. Patricia stood on her front porch, arms crossed, radiating hostility even from a distance. The inspection lasted about 45 minutes, with the technicians occasionally conferring and pointing at various aspects of her electrical setup. After they left, I gave it an hour before checking my email. There was a message from Carol. "Mr. Carter, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. Our preliminary meter audit has revealed several concerning discrepancies with the property at 4782 Saguaro Vista Drive. We've documented evidence of irregular usage patterns and potential meter tampering. A full investigation is now underway. We'll keep you updated on any developments that pertain to your original complaint. Thank you for your cooperation in maintaining utility service integrity." I read the email 3 times, a slow smile spreading across my face. Irregular usage patterns and potential meter tampering. Patricia hadn't just tried to steal my electricity. She'd been doing something sketchy with her own meter, something that had caught SRP's attention the moment they looked closely. The next few days were quiet. Patricia didn't come by to yell at me, didn't send any retaliatory HOA violation notices, didn't even make eye contact when we both happened to be getting our mail at the same time. She looked stressed, her usual impeccable appearance slightly rumpled, her expression tighter than normal. I wondered what SRP had found, what evidence they were compiling, but I didn't push. These things took time. 2 weeks later, I got the follow-up email I'd been waiting for. Carol asked if I could come to the SRP office in Temp for an interview. They wanted to go over some findings from their investigation and get my statement on record. I agreed immediately, taking a personal day from my job at the architectural firm downtown. The SRP building was a sleek modern structure with solar panels covering most of the roof, appropriately enough. Carol met me in the lobby, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of utility fraud imaginable. She led me to a small conference room where another person was waiting, a man in his 50s who introduced himself as Derek Lopez, senior investigator. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Carter," Derek said, gesturing for me to sit. "Your complaint opened up a significant investigation. What we've found at 4782 Seguero Vista Drive is fairly extensive." He opened a folder and spread several documents across the table. I recognized photos of Patricia's electrical meter, along with diagrams and highlighted sections of what looked like usage reports. "Miss Morrison has been engaging in meter tampering for approximately 3 years," Derek continued. "She installed a bypass on her meter that diverts roughly 30% of her electrical usage away from our billing system. We estimate she's stolen approximately $12,000 worth of electricity during that time period." I let out a low whistle. $12,000, give or take, Carol added. "She has a fairly sophisticated setup." The bypass was well hidden, and usage patterns were irregular enough that our automated systems didn't flag it. But once we knew to look, based on your complaint about her attempting to steal power from your property, the evidence was unmistakable. Derek slid another document toward me. "This is where your statement becomes important. Miss Morrison is claiming that any irregularities with her meter are the result of faulty equipment, not intentional tampering. However, you have documented evidence of her deliberately attempting to steal utility services from your property, including her admission that her system couldn't handle her planned load. That establishes a pattern of behavior and intent." I looked at the photos again, seeing the small metal box attached to the side of Patricia's meter. It looked professional, almost official, like something a technician might install. "She really went all out with this, didn't she? People who commit utility fraud often do," Carol said. "They rationalize it as the company being too big to notice, or rates being too high, or some other justification. But it's still theft, and in Arizona, it's a criminal offense." I spent the next hour going through everything in detail. My initial discovery of the extension cord, the confrontation with Patricia, her admission about needing more power than her system could provide, and my decision to contact SRP instead of just letting it go. Derek recorded everything, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When we finished, he closed his folder with an air of satisfaction. "This will be forwarded to the Mesa Police Department," he said. "Given the amount involved and the duration of the fraud, we're recommending criminal charges. You may be contacted by investigators or asked to provide testimony if this goes to trial." "Happy to help," I said, and I meant it. Patricia had spent years using her HOA position to bully neighbors into compliance with increasingly petty rules. The idea that her own house was literally built on theft, that she'd been stealing thousands of dollars while writing violation notices for someone's trash, and being visible from the street, felt like karmic justice on a cosmic scale. The neighborhood grapevine lit up about a week later when a Mesa PD patrol car appeared in front of Patricia's house. I heard about it from my next-door neighbor, Margaret, an elderly woman who spent most mornings watching the street from her front window like it was her personal reality TV show. "2 officers went inside," Margaret reported breathlessly when I came out to water my plants. "They were in there for over an hour. Patricia looked absolutely distraught when they left. 'Do you know what's going on?' I played dumb. 'No idea, maybe a security issue.' But I knew exactly what was going on. The police were investigating the utility fraud, gathering evidence, building their case. Patricia Morrison, HOA president and neighborhood tyrant, was about to face actual consequences for once in her life. The formal charges came down in early August. Patricia Ann Morrison was charged with 1 count of theft of utility services, a Class 1 misdemeanor, and 1 count of fraud schemes and artifices, a Class 2 felony, because the amount exceeded $3,000. The felony charge was the serious one, carrying a potential sentence of up to 12.5 years in prison, though first-time offenders rarely got anywhere near the maximum. The neighborhood reacted with a mixture of shock and vindication. For every person who defended Patricia, insisting there must be some mistake, there were 2 others who'd been on the receiving end of her HOA enforcement and felt she had it coming. The Facebook group for Sagaro Vista Estates exploded with speculation and argument. Several people called for her immediate resignation from the HOA board. Others suggested waiting until the legal process played out. A few hardy souls even suggested that maybe, just maybe, the HOA had become too aggressive under her leadership, and this was a wake-up call to reassess how the organization functioned. Patricia herself went into hiding. Her car stayed in the garage, her windows remained curtained, and she stopped attending HOA meetings. The vice president, a mild-mannered accountant named Robert Chen, stepped up to run things in her absence. His first act was to propose a comprehensive review of all HOA rules and enforcement procedures, which passed unanimously at the next board meeting. I attended that meeting, sitting in the back and saying nothing. It felt good to see the organization start to shift away from Patricia's iron-fisted approach. Several people spoke about violations they'd received that seemed excessive or unfairly targeted. One woman described getting fined $200 because her house number wasn't visible enough from the street, even though she'd just had it repainted the month before. A man talked about being threatened with legal action because his desert willow tree was supposedly encroaching on common area, even though a survey proved it was entirely on his property. The stories piled up, painting a picture of an HOA that had lost sight of its purpose under Patricia's leadership. I thought about speaking up, about explaining my role in Patricia's downfall, but I kept quiet. The evidence spoke for itself, and I didn't need recognition for doing what any reasonable person would do when faced with theft. The preliminary hearing happened in September, in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and air conditioning. I sat in the gallery, watching as Patricia and her lawyer approached the bench. She looked smaller somehow, diminished without her usual armor of authority. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman from a Scottsdale firm, argued for dismissal based on insufficient evidence. The prosecutor, a younger man with the patient demeanor of someone who'd handled hundreds of these cases, systematically dismantled every argument. He presented the photos of the meter bypass. He showed the usage analysis demonstrating the theft. He played my audio recording of Patricia admitting her electrical system couldn't handle the load she needed, establishing motive and intent. And he called me to the stand to describe her attempt to steal power from my property. I kept my testimony factual and unemotional. Yes, I'd found the extension cord. Yes, Patricia had admitted she needed more power than her system could provide. Yes, I'd contacted SRP because I was concerned about both the attempted theft from my property and the implications for her own electrical setup. The defense attorney tried to rattle me during cross-examination, suggesting I had some personal vendetta against Patricia, but I held firm. The facts were the facts, regardless of my feelings about her HOA leadership. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Patricia's bail conditions were modified to include staying away from HOA business, which effectively ended her presidency. The board voted to remove her officially 2 days later, installing Robert as the permanent president. The trial itself was scheduled for November. In the meantime, life in Sagaro Vista Estates slowly returned to a new normal. The HOA under Robert's leadership was notably more reasonable. Violation notices decreased by about 70%, and the ones that were issued actually made sense, addressing legitimate safety or property value concerns rather than petty aesthetic preferences. Several long-standing disputes were resolved through mediation rather than threats of legal action. It was like the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled. I ran into Patricia once during this period, at the Safeway on Power Road. She was alone in the cereal aisle, staring at the boxes like she couldn't remember what she'd come to buy. I almost turned around and left, but something made me approach. "Patricia," I said quietly. She looked up, and for a moment I saw raw hatred in her eyes. Then it faded into something closer to exhausted resignation. "Stephen, for what it's worth, I didn't set out to ruin your life," I said. "I just wanted you to stop stealing from me." Her laugh was bitter. "You have no idea what you've done. I'm facing felony charges. I might go to prison. My reputation is destroyed, all over some electricity." "All over $12,000 of theft," I corrected. "And the fact that you thought your position meant you could take whatever you wanted without consequences." "I kept that neighborhood running," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I maintained property values. I enforced standards. I did all the work nobody else wanted to do, and this is how I'm repaid." "You were a bully," I said simply. "You used the HOA rules as a weapon to control people, and when that wasn't enough, you literally stole from the utility company and tried to steal from me." "The enforcement and the theft weren't separate issues, Patricia. They were the same issue. You thought you were above the rules you imposed on everyone else." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Her shoulders sagged. "I'm going to lose everything." "Maybe," I acknowledged. "But that's the consequence of your choices, not my complaint. I didn't tamper with your meter. I didn't steal $12,000. You did." I left her there in the cereal aisle, feeling neither triumphant nor guilty, just tired. The whole situation had been exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with the actual time invested. It was the emotional weight of standing up to someone who'd spent years cultivating unchecked authority, the stress of waiting to see if the system would actually hold her accountable. The trial in November lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically, building a comprehensive case that Patricia had knowingly and deliberately tampered with her electrical meter to avoid paying for services she used. They brought in expert witnesses from SRP who explained exactly how the bypass worked, how it would have required specialized knowledge to install, and how the usage patterns proved intentional fraud rather than equipment malfunction. They showed photos of Patricia's garage workshop, where investigators had found wire cutters, electrical tape, and instructional printouts about meter configuration, effectively demolishing the defense's claim that any irregularities were the result of faulty equipment. I testified again, providing the context of her attempted theft from my property. The prosecutor used it to establish a pattern, arguing that someone who would boldly steal from a neighbor would certainly be willing to steal from a faceless utility company. Patricia's lawyer tried to paint me as a disgruntled neighbor with an axe to grind, but the audio recording of Patricia admitting her electrical limitations was damning. You couldn't explain away her own words. The defense's strategy seemed to be humanizing Patricia, presenting her as a dedicated community volunteer who'd made a mistake under financial pressure. They called character witnesses who testified about her HOA work, her organization of neighborhood events, her responsiveness to resident concerns. A few people even claimed she'd helped them navigate complex property issues or resolve disputes between neighbors. It was a side of Patricia I hadn't seen, and I tried to consider it fairly. Maybe she had done some good work for the community, but it didn't excuse theft, and it didn't excuse the authoritarian approach that had made so many residents miserable. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on the misdemeanor theft charge. Guilty on the felony fraud charge. Patricia's face crumpled when the forewoman read the decision, and her lawyer immediately put a hand on her arm, whispering something I couldn't hear. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In Arizona, a Class 2 felony for a first-time offender typically resulted in probation rather than prison time, but restitution would be mandatory. Patricia would have to pay back the $12,000 she'd stolen, plus penalties and court costs. She'd also have a felony record, which would impact her employment prospects, her ability to hold certain professional licenses, and her general standing in the community. The day of sentencing arrived with the kind of crisp November weather that made living in Arizona worthwhile. I took another personal day to attend, feeling like I owed it to the process to see it through to the end. The courtroom was less crowded this time. Just Patricia and her lawyer, the prosecutor, a handful of observers, and me. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s named Judge Reyes, reviewed the case materials before addressing the court. She noted Patricia's lack of criminal history, her age, and the character witness testimony from the trial. She also noted the significant amount of theft, the premeditation involved in installing the meter bypass, and the attempted theft from my property that had triggered the investigation. Miss Morrison, Judge Reyes said, looking directly at Patricia, the court recognizes that you have been a contributing member of your community in many ways. However, your actions in this case demonstrate a troubling sense of entitlement and a willingness to break the law when it suited your purposes. Theft of utility services affects all ratepayers, as companies must pass the costs of fraud onto honest customers. Your theft was not a victimless crime, nor was it a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a systematic scheme that continued for years. Patricia's lawyer started to say something, but Judge Reyes held up a hand. You are sentenced to 3 years supervised probation. During this time, you will complete 200 hours of community service, specifically with organizations that provide utility assistance to low-income residents. You will pay full restitution to Salt River Project in the amount of $12,247, plus court costs and administrative fees. You are prohibited from holding any position of authority in homeowner associations or similar organizations for the duration of your probation. Failure to comply with any condition of this probation will result in incarceration. Do you understand these terms? Patricia's voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. Additionally, Judge Reyes continued, I'm ordering that you write a formal letter of apology to Mr. Stephen Carter for your attempted theft of his utility services. While that incident didn't result in financial loss due to his prompt action, it was still a violation of his property rights and his trust as a neighbor. I hadn't expected that. I watched Patricia's shoulders shake slightly, whether from anger or distress, I couldn't tell. The judge banged her gavel, and it was over. Patricia Morrison, former HOA president and neighborhood enforcer, was now a convicted felon on probation. Her lawyer hustled her out of the courtroom before anyone could approach, but I caught her eye as she passed. She looked away quickly, her face flushed with what might have been shame. The prosecutor found me in the hallway afterward. "Good job staying consistent with your testimony," he said, shaking my hand. "Cases like this often fall apart because witnesses get intimidated or change their stories." "You didn't waver." "I just told the truth," I said. "That's rarer than you'd think." He smiled slightly. "For what it's worth, I think the judge got it right. Prison wouldn't serve anyone in this situation, but the probation conditions will actually make her confront what she did. Community service helping people with utility bills. That's going to be uncomfortable for someone who stole $12,000 of electricity." I left the courthouse feeling oddly hollow. It wasn't satisfaction exactly, more like the completion of something inevitable. Patricia had built her life on a foundation of control and entitlement, and it had finally collapsed under the weight of her own actions. I'd just been the catalyst, the person who happened to notice and decided not to look away. The letter arrived 3 weeks later, a formal piece of cardstock in an expensive envelope. Patricia's handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. "Dear Stephen, I am writing to apologize for my actions in attempting to use your electrical service without permission. My behavior was inappropriate and violated your property rights. I understand that my actions caused you concern and inconvenience. I take full responsibility and regret the incident. I hope that in time, the neighborhood can move forward from this situation. Sincerely, Patricia Morrison." It was the most emotionless apology I'd ever read, clearly written to satisfy the judge's order rather than express genuine remorse. But I filed it away anyway, a final piece of documentation in a bizarre chapter of suburban life. Christmas came to Saguaro Vista Estates with the usual explosion of lights and inflatable decorations. Under Robert's leadership, the HOA had relaxed the holiday display restrictions, leading to a spectacular light show that attracted visitors from neighboring developments. Someone organized an informal competition for best display, with voting done by donation to a local food bank. It was the kind of community spirit that should have existed all along, free from Patricia's rigid enforcement. I decorated my own house modestly, just some white lights along the roofline and a small tree visible through the front window. On Christmas Eve, Robert stopped by with a bottle of wine and an unexpected confession. "I should have stood up to Patricia years ago," he said, sitting in my living room while the sun set over the Superstition Mountains in the distance. "I was on the board the whole time, but I just let her run things because it was easier than fighting. A lot of people suffered because I took the path of least resistance." "You're fixing it now," I pointed out. "Maybe, but it shouldn't have taken a criminal conviction to make the HOA functional." He sighed, rotating the wine glass in his hands. "I heard from Patricia's lawyer, actually. She's trying to sell her house, leave the neighborhood. Too much shame to stay, I guess." I wasn't surprised. "Where's she going?" "Somewhere in Tucson, apparently, far enough to start over, close enough to comply with her probation requirements." Robert looked at me seriously. "You know some people blame you for this whole thing, right? They think you should have just let the extension cord thing go, handled it privately." "I tried to handle it privately," I reminded him. "I confronted her directly, explained it was theft, and asked her to stop. She threatened me with HOA retaliation instead of apologizing. What happened after that was a consequence of her choices, not mine." "I know. And for what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. The meter tampering would have continued indefinitely if you hadn't reported it. The attempted theft from your property just revealed a larger pattern." He raised his glass in a small toast. "To accountability." "To accountability," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. Patricia's house sold in February to a young couple with twin toddlers and a friendly golden retriever. They introduced themselves to the neighborhood with homemade cookies and genuine smiles, the kind of neighbors who immediately made the street feel more welcoming. I helped them move some furniture on their first day, and they mentioned that they'd gotten the house for below market value due to the seller's urgency to relocate. They didn't know the full story, and I didn't volunteer it. They deserved to start fresh without the baggage of their house's previous owner. I ran into Patricia one final time in March, at the DMV in Mesa, where we'd both come to renew our vehicle registrations. We ended up in adjacent chairs in the waiting area, watching the number display with the special kind of patience that government offices require. "Stephen," she said after a few minutes of loaded silence. "Patricia. I'm moving next week. Tucson, fresh start." She stared straight ahead at the number display. I heard, "I hope it works out for you," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you really, after everything?" I considered the question seriously. "Yeah, actually, I don't think you're evil, Patricia. I think you got caught up in power and control and lost perspective. The HOA presidency became your identity, and you started treating it like you were running a kingdom instead of a volunteer organization. The theft was wrong, obviously, but I think it came from the same place. This sense that rules applied to other people, but not to you. Careful," she said dryly. "That almost sounds like empathy. I can empathize with how you got there while still believing you deserved consequences for what you did." I watched a family with 3 kids negotiate the cramped waiting area. For what it's worth, the neighborhood is better now. More relaxed. Robert's doing a good job. People are actually enjoying living there instead of walking on eggshells waiting for violation notices. Patricia's jaw tightened. "I maintained property values. At the cost of making everyone miserable," I countered. "Property values matter, sure, but so does quality of life. You forgot that part." "G847, the electronic voice announced. Patricia's number. She stood, smoothing her slacks with hands that shook slightly. "Goodbye, Stephen." "Goodbye, Patricia." I watched her walk to the counter, this woman who'd once wielded petty authority like a sword and now faced the consequences of believing herself above accountability. Part of me felt bad for her. Most of me just felt relieved that the nightmare of her leadership was over. My own number came up 15 minutes later, and I handled my registration renewal with the usual bureaucratic efficiency. Driving home through Mesa's afternoon traffic, I thought about how something as simple as finding an extension cord plugged into my outlet had unraveled an entire scheme of theft and abuse of power. If I'd ignored it, if I just unplugged it and said nothing, Patricia would still be HOA president. She'd still be stealing electricity. She'd still be making life miserable for anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards, but I hadn't ignored it. I'd stood up, documented everything, and let the system work. It wasn't glamorous or heroic. It was just being a reasonable person who refused to accept unreasonable behavior. Sagaro Vista Estates settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following months. The HOA meetings became productive instead of adversarial. Violation notices were reserved for actual problems. Neighbors started organizing informal gatherings, barbecues, and game nights, the kind of community bonding that Patricia's rigid enforcement had inadvertently prevented. My own involvement with the HOA increased slightly, joining the Architectural Review Committee to help evaluate proposals for home modifications. It was satisfying work, finding ways to say yes to homeowners while still maintaining reasonable standards. The extension cord incident became neighborhood legend, the story told in hushed tones at parties and pool gatherings. Details got embellished over time, the tent becoming bigger, Patricia's reaction more dramatic, my confrontation more heroic. I didn't correct the exaggerations. The core truth was there, even if the specifics got fuzzy around the edges. Summer rolled around again, bringing the punishing heat that defined Arizona living. My electricity bill arrived in July, showing reasonable usage despite running the air conditioning constantly. I thought about Patricia and her $12,000 theft, wondering if she was keeping up with the restitution payments, or if she was struggling under the weight of her felony conviction. The community service hours helping low-income residents with utility bills must have been particularly galling for someone who'd stolen so much. But that was her burden to carry, not mine. I'd done what I needed to do, protected my property, exposed a pattern of theft, and helped shift the HOA away from authoritarian overreach. The rest was up to the criminal justice system and Patricia's own choices about how to rebuild her life. Robert stopped by one evening with news. The board voted to create a formal ethics policy, he said, showing me a draft document on his tablet. It includes clear prohibitions on using HOA authority for personal benefit, requirements for transparency in decision-making, and a process for residents to challenge enforcement actions they think are unfair. We're modeling it after best practices from other associations. I skimmed the document, impressed by its thoroughness. This is good work. It's necessary work, Robert corrected. What happened with Patricia could happen again if we don't have safeguards. Power attracts people who want to abuse it. We need structures that make abuse harder and accountability easier. You should run for state legislature with that platform, I joked. God, no. I have enough bureaucracy dealing with the HOA. He laughed and pocketed the tablet. But seriously, thank you for not letting it go. For pushing back. A lot of people complained privately about Patricia's leadership, but you were the one who actually did something about it. I just didn't want to pay for her event electricity, I said. You did more than that, and you know it. Robert clapped me on the shoulder. The neighborhood owes you one. After he left, I sat on my back patio watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The mountains stood dark against the brilliant colors, ancient and unchanging while human dramas played out in their shadow. Somewhere in Tucson, Patricia was probably watching a similar sunset, contemplating how different her life looked now compared to a year ago. How a single extension cord, a single moment of entitlement, had cascaded into criminal charges and exile from the community she'd controlled for so long. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, but I didn't regret my role in it either. Sometimes accountability was uncomfortable. Sometimes doing the right thing created conflict and consequences that rippled outward in unexpected ways. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was looking away, accepting abuse, letting people in power take whatever they wanted simply because confrontation was difficult. The extension cord incident taught me something important about suburban life, about community, about the quiet corruptions that could take root when good people stayed silent. Patricia Morrison had been a tyrant not because she was uniquely evil, but because the system allowed it. Because people were too tired, too busy, too conflict-averse to push back against incremental overreach. By the time anyone realized how bad things had gotten, the pattern was entrenched, and challenging it seemed impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It just required someone to notice, to document, to refuse to accept the unacceptable. In my case, that someone was me. In other neighborhoods, other associations, other communities, it might be someone else. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was the willingness to stand up, even when it was easier to stay silent. As darkness settled over Saguaro Vista Estates, Lights began flickering on in houses up and down the street. Families gathering for dinner, kids doing homework, people living their normal suburban lives without fear of petty enforcement or arbitrary violations. That was Patricia's real legacy, though she'd never see it that way. Her downfall had freed the neighborhood to be what it should have been all along, a community of neighbors rather than subjects under bureaucratic rule. I went inside, locked up for the night, and settled in to watch some television before bed. Life went on, as it always did. The drama faded into memory, replaced by new concerns and everyday routines. But sometimes, when I saw that outdoor electrical outlet on the side of my house, I thought about that extension cord and everything that followed. How something so simple had revealed something so complex. How refusing to be a victim of petty theft had exposed systematic fraud. How one person standing up had changed an entire neighborhood's trajectory. It wasn't the story I'd expected to tell about my time in Sagaro Vista Estates. But it was the story that mattered, the story about accountability and consequences, and the small acts of courage that kept communities honest. Patricia Morrison had learned the hard way that authority without accountability was just another form of theft. And I'd learned that sometimes the best thing you could do for your neighbors was simply refuse to accept the unacceptable, even when everyone else had given up trying. The next HOA meeting I attended as usual, sitting through discussions about landscaping standards and parking regulations. The tone was collaborative, with board members actually listening to resident concerns instead of dictating from on high. At one point, someone mentioned a property issue that would have triggered an immediate violation under Patricia's regime. Robert suggested a warning letter first, giving the homeowner 30 days to address it before any fines were considered. The motion passed unanimously. Walking home after the meeting, I passed the corner lot where Patricia had erected her event tent, where the extension cord had snaked across the property line to tap my power. The current owners had installed a beautiful butterfly garden there, native plants arranged to attract pollinators. It was exactly the kind of improvement the neighborhood needed, something that added beauty without demanding uniformity. I stood there for a moment, remembering that scorching July afternoon when my lights had dimmed, when I discovered the theft, when I'd made the decision to not let it slide. Everything that followed had stemmed from that single choice. Patricia's conviction, her exile, the HOA reforms, the improved neighborhood atmosphere, all of it traced back to me unplugging that extension cord and making a phone call. Would I do it again? Absolutely, without hesitation. Because the alternative, the path of least resistance that Robert had mentioned, led to places where bullies thrived and good people suffered in silence. I'd spent too much of my life watching injustice unfold and telling myself it wasn't my problem. The extension cord incident had been my line in the sand, the moment I decided my problem was anything that happened on my property, to my meter, under my watch. Patricia had gambled that I'd be like everyone else in the neighborhood, too intimidated or too apathetic to fight back. She'd miscalculated badly, and in doing so, she'd accidentally given me the evidence I needed to bring down her entire house of cards. The attempted theft from my property had been brazen enough to justify investigation. The meter tampering investigation had revealed years of systematic fraud. Her own words, her own admissions about electrical capacity and power needs, had sealed her fate. Sometimes justice required luck, but it also required someone willing to act when luck presented an opportunity. I'd been that person, and while the process hadn't been pleasant, the outcome was worth every uncomfortable moment, every tense confrontation, every hour spent documenting and testifying. As I reached my own house and climbed the steps to my front door, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because I destroyed Patricia Morrison's life, which had never been the goal, but because I'd protected my community from someone who viewed neighbors as subjects and HOA authority as a license for exploitation. The neighborhood was better now. Measurably, demonstrably better. And I'd played a role in that transformation, however accidental it might have been at the start. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window, the same window where my lights had dimmed that July afternoon. Everything was bright now, power flowing reliably, no unauthorized drains siphoning off electricity meant for my home. It was such a small thing, really, such a mundane aspect of modern life. But it represented something larger, the principle that resources weren't communal unless explicitly shared, that authority required consent, that taking without asking was theft regardless of who did it or what justification they offered. Patricia Morrison had forgotten those principles, if she'd ever understood them in the first place. Her downfall served as a reminder, not just for our neighborhood, but for anyone who mistook position for permission. The extension cord had been her mistake. The investigation had been her reckoning. And the conviction had been her consequence, earned through years of choices that prioritized control over community, enforcement over empathy, power over accountability. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and headed to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new moments requiring decisions about when to speak up and when to stay silent. But tonight, I could rest easy knowing I'd done right by my neighborhood, my neighbors, and myself. The extension cord incident was over, resolved as thoroughly as such things could be. Patricia was gone, the HOA was reformed, and Sagero Vista Estates was finally the community it should have been all along. And if anyone ever tried to tap my power again, well, I knew exactly what to do about it.